Based on the fact-check, one detail turned out to be a real error, calling it a U.S. Air Force base. The Air Force didn't exist until 1947, and a few embellishments, the general's car, escaped their handlers, roosted under a fuel tank, are unverified or contradicted by the primary sourced accounts, NPS, Wikipedia, Kufer's book. So those are cut per the aggressive deletion rule. Everything else checked out true. Here's the clean narration. All right, so on May 15, 1943, a batch of live bats, actual bats, wings and all armed with tiny incendiary bombs, woke up early, took flight, and burned a hangar to the ground. This happened at a U.S. Army airfield on American soil in broad daylight during a live weapons test that was supposed to be entirely under control. And the man responsible for setting that whole chain of events in motion wasn't a soldier, a spy, or a saboteur. He was a dentist from Pennsylvania. This is the true story of Project X-Ray, quite possibly the strangest weapon the United States ever seriously considered, and the reason a bunch of bats nearly took down one of our own airfields before they ever got anywhere near the enemy. Let's start with the dentist, because you really can't tell this story without him. His name was Lytle S. Adams, and in early 1942, just weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when the whole country was still reeling and looking for any way to strike back, he was, on paper, nobody special, a private citizen. No military rank, no defense contract, no scientific credentials. Just a man with a wild idea and apparently enough connections to get that idea pitched directly to the White House. Before the war, Adams had spent time exploring Carlsbad Caverns down in New Mexico, and while most tourists walking through those caves are busy admiring the stalactites, Adams noticed something else entirely. Millions of Mexican free-tailed bats pouring out of the cave mouth at dusk, an enormous living cloud rising into the evening sky and scattering out across the desert. It's the kind of sight that sticks with you, and it clearly stuck with him because he started connecting it to things he knew about the war effort. He knew these bats could carry more than their own body weight in flight. He knew they roosted by the millions, packed into tight, hidden little spaces, cracks, crevices, eaves, anywhere dark and enclosed. And he knew that Japan's cities at the time were built largely out of wood and paper, construction that would go up like kindling given the right spark. Put those three facts together, and Adams had his idea. What if you attached a small incendiary device to a bat, released thousands of them over a Japanese city under cover of darkness, and simply let the bats do what bats already do naturally: scatter, find shelter, and tuck themselves into the eaves and attics and rafters of the very buildings you wanted to burn. Only after they'd settled in and hidden themselves away would the timers on their tiny bombs finally go off. Now, on its face, it sounds like something ripped straight out of a pulp comic book, a mad scientist scheme, not a real military program. But here's the part that should really stop you in your tracks. This was not some fringe idea that got laughed out of a meeting and quietly buried in a filing cabinet. Adams got a letter describing the concept to President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, and Roosevelt, rather than dismissing it, forwarded it along for serious evaluation. And once it landed on the desks of actual military researchers, instead of dying there, the idea only gained momentum. The National Defense Research Committee got involved. So did the U.S. Army Air Forces. Later, the Navy came in, and eventually the Marine Corps took over parts of the program as it evolved. Over the life of the project, the government sank roughly $2 million into what would eventually be codenamed Project X-Ray. $2 million in early 1940s money, spent on the very specific proposition of strapping small bombs to bats. Before you picture some slapdash backyard operation, understand that this had real, serious scientific muscle behind it. One of the chemists who worked on the incendiary devices was Louis Fieser, the same Harvard chemist responsible for developing napalm, which tells you something about the caliber of people the military was willing to assign to this. Fieser's team engineered a miniature incendiary capsule, made small and light enough for a bat to actually carry in flight, fitted with a timer delay so the bat would have enough time to land and tuck itself into a hiding spot before the device ignited. Meanwhile, other researchers dug into bat biology itself, studying hibernation cycles to figure out how to keep the animals dormant and easy to transport in a cooled, sedated state, and then how to wake them back up and get them flying once they were released from altitude out of specially designed bomb bay canisters. Engineers went so far as to design stacked cardboard trays inside those canisters, trays that would open automatically as they fell through the air, giving the groggy, just-woken bats a window to come to their senses and fly out before the whole canister assembly hit the ground. And this is exactly where the story stops sounding like a joke and starts sounding like an honest-to-goodness military program, because they didn't just theorize all this. They tested it. With live bats, with live incendiary devices, or at least dummy versions of them for the earliest trials. Researchers ran experiments at sites including Muroc Lake out in California and over at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. Engineers went so far as to construct mock Japanese-style structures, built specifically out of the same kinds of wood and paper materials common in Japanese architecture, just to see how well fires started by the bats would catch and spread through that kind of construction. Remarkably, there's still archival test footage of all of this sitting in declassified government files today. Grainy black and white film reels showing bats being released in test conditions and showing those mock buildings going up in flames afterward. And by most accounts, the early trials actually showed real promise. The bats did exactly what bats naturally do. They sought out dark, tight, sheltered spaces to hide in, and it turned out those were precisely the kinds of spaces where a small fire would catch fastest and do the most damage. But if you've ever so much as tried to shoo a single bat out of an open window, you already have a pretty good sense of where this story is headed next. On May 15, 1943, the program had its single most infamous incident at Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico, not far, fittingly enough, from the very caverns that had inspired Adams's idea in the first place. During a round of testing, a batch of bats that had already been fitted with live incendiary devices got loose before they were meant to be released in a controlled setting. And instead of flying off obediently towards some mock village built for the test, they did exactly what any bat would do when it suddenly finds itself loose on a military base. They went looking for the nearest dark, sheltered nook to hide in. Some of them ended up roosting in and around the base's own buildings. Before anyone could round them up or intervene, the timers on their little bombs simply ran out, as they were designed to do. A fire broke out and tore through a hangar. In other words, an American airbase had just been set ablaze by an American secret weapon, without a single enemy soldier anywhere within 1,000 miles. You would think, understandably, that this would have been the moment the whole program quietly got shut down, and it's a fair question why it wasn't. But remarkably, the program didn't die there. Responsibility for Project X-Ray actually shifted over to the Marine Corps later in 1943, and testing continued afterward in a considerably more controlled and disciplined fashion. Scientists kept refining the canister design, the release altitude, and the timing on the incendiary devices, trying to iron out exactly the kind of failure that had caused the Carlsbad fire. And by most accounts, these later, more carefully managed tests actually performed better than anyone had expected going in. In controlled trials, fires triggered by the bats reportedly outperformed some conventional incendiary tests at igniting the mock targets built to represent enemy structures. This wasn't just a curiosity that kept sputtering into accidents. On paper, at least, it was shaping up to be a genuinely promising weapons concept. So why isn't Project X-Ray remembered today as a decisive weapon of the Second World War? The honest answer really comes down to timing and competition for resources. By 1944, the United States was pouring an almost unimaginable amount of money, scientific talent, and industrial capacity into a very different, far more secretive project: the atomic bomb. Military leadership had hard choices to make about where the country's limited wartime resources, and crucially, its aircraft and trained personnel, were going to be directed. Project X-Ray, for all its promise, still wasn't fully combat-ready, and it was now competing directly for attention and funding against a weapon that promised to end the war outright. In 1944, the Bat bomb program was officially canceled. Some accounts point to Navy leadership concluding that the program simply wasn't going to be ready in time to matter, especially as the Manhattan Project kept accelerating toward completion. The dentist's vision of a million-bat air raid over Japan never actually happened, not because the underlying science had failed, but because the arc of history had already moved on to something else first. It's worth sitting with just how strange that is for a moment. A private citizen with no military background at all wrote a letter, and that letter eventually turned into a $2 million, multi-year, multi-branch military research program. One that involved Ivy League chemists, live animal testing, and mock villages built out in the Utah desert, and it came remarkably close to a limited operational deployment. It's the kind of story that sounds far too outlandish to possibly be true, and yet it's sitting right there in declassified U.S. government archives, complete with old test reels of bats gliding out of canisters over the American Southwest. Little Adams, for his part, never stopped believing in the idea, even decades later. He reportedly maintained, long after the war, that if the program had simply been allowed to run its course, it could have caused significant damage to Japanese infrastructure without putting a single American life at risk in the air over enemy territory. Since the bats, unlike bomber crews, couldn't exactly be shot down by anti-aircraft fire. We'll never know for certain whether he was right. What we do know is that, for a few strange years in the middle of the 20th century, some of America's sharpest scientific minds took a dentist's fever dream completely seriously, built it from the ground up, tested it again and again, and at least once set fire to their own airfield trying to prove it could work. It's one of those wonderfully only in America stories, equal parts ingenuity, grit, and pure. Did that actually happen? Disbelief. And it did happen, every strange bit of it. If you enjoy digging into the odd, true corners of American history like this one, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and drop a comment telling me what strange chapter of U.S. history you want us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.